Hey guys, if you were born an ordinary subject of Elizabethan England, let's say around the year 1583, you'd probably enter this world in a smoky, cramped cottage with uneven floorboards, a pig in the corner, and a midwife who smells strongly of rosemary and wet wool. You'd be swaddled in scratchy linen strips, your head the size of a small turnip, and your only birthright would be your family's place in the sumptuary ladder. Your parents? Likely peasants, or maybe a yeoman and his wife if you're lucky, both perpetually chapped from the cold and worried about how many pennies they could spare to keep you alive through your first winter. As for you, you're mostly bald, shockingly pink, and immediately suspicious of the world. Especially when they rub mustard on your gums or hang garlic in your cradle to keep away witches. You'll eat a lot of mushy barley, and maybe, if someone in the village is generous, a bit of boiled mutton fat scraped from a pan. You'll survive, though, because infants in your family tend to do so if they can sleep through shouting neighbors and avoid the neighbor's goat kicking over the firewood. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And please drop your location and local time in the comments. Let's see who else is drifting off beside you. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's talk about wool hats. Yes, wool hats. Because in Elizabethan England, it is literally illegal not to wear one. Well, not just any hat, and not every day, but specifically, a wool cap of English make must be worn on Sundays and holidays by every person over the age of 6, unless you're a noble, a knight, or grievously infirm. This isn't a fashion suggestion. This is Parliament-backed law, and failure to comply results in a fine of 3 farthings per offence, which may sound quaint until you realize that's roughly a loaf of bread, or, more importantly, a tankard of ale. You, as an average citizen, probably own 2 caps, one for everyday mucking about, and one for more formal appearances, which still smells faintly of the sheep it came from. The hats are thick, often itchy, and shaped a bit like upside-down pudding bowls, and wearing them is less about keeping your head warm and more about boosting the local wool trade. This was, after all, a time when supporting English industry could literally be enforced on your scalp. You wake up on a chilly Sunday morning, step onto the cold-packed dirt floor, and reach for your hat the way someone today might grab their phone. It sits beside the hearth, slightly damp from last night's frost creeping in, and as you pull it over your head, it doesn't so much stretch as it negotiates with your ears. You're not alone in this. Every man, woman, and reluctant child across town is doing the same, with mothers pulling hats down over wiggling toddlers and neighbors shouting over hedges. Oi, you forgot your brim. It's not entirely unpleasant. In fact, there's something comforting about knowing that everyone round you is also marching off to church or to market, with a little dome of sheep wool atop their head, like a social contract made visible. Some folk even try to decorate theirs with a sprig of dried thyme or a crude embroidery of their initials, though that treads dangerously close to looking above your station, which, spoiler alert, is also illegal. The idea behind the law is patriotic. Elizabeth Fair, ever the economic nationalist, believes in supporting homegrown industry, especially the wool trade, which forms the backbone of English commerce. And so, the Cap Act of 1571 becomes law, stipulating that hats must not only be made of English wool, but also woven, finished, and dyed within the realm. In short, no foreign felts. Your scalp becomes a battlefield in the war for national self-sufficiency. Of course, not everyone obeys. There are whispers about Henry Tuckett, the cooper's apprentice, who swears he gets headaches from wool and tries to pass off a felted beaver hat as compliant. The local church warden catches on, and Henry spends the next 3 Sundays scrubbing pews in public penance, a bright red cap of shame tied under his chin with stiff ribbon, a fringed tidbit. Some town records show officials literally chasing hatless villagers down lanes to collect their farthing fines, one of them tripping over a goose in the process. You wear your cap without complaint, mostly. It hides your greasy hair, keeps your ears moderately warm, and reminds you, every itchy minute, that you belong to a kingdom of rules, most of them oddly specific, and just inconvenient enough to ensure that you never quite forget them. What's stranger still is that, over time, these laws start to feel familiar, comfortable even. You know the hat law, just like you know the smell of your neighbor's wood smoke or the sound of pigs grunting in the alley. The law becomes part of the texture of your week. It gives the town something to gossip about and gives the officials a job that's not entirely soul-crushing. And in a world where most things are uncertain, where crops might fail or someone might fall ill or a passing noble might commandeer your best hen, having a law about hats of all things feels oddly safe. So you continue to wear yours. It molds to the shape of your head, absorbs years of your breath and labor and size. And one day, when you're old and your hair has thinned and your hands shake just a bit when you tie your belt, you reach for that same woolen cap, softened now by decades of wear, and settle it on your head, like a memory you can still touch. And it fits. You start the morning with your usual groan, which echoes off the wattle and daub walls and mingles with the soft clatter of your mother poking at last night's embers in the hearth. She's humming the same half-song she always hums when she's in a decent mood. Something about a weasel and a miller's daughter, though no one really knows the words anymore. Outside, the sky is grey in that way it always seems to be, and the thatch roof drips cold water in a rhythm you've learned to ignore. You stretch, yawn, and reach lazily for the leather strap hanging beside the bed. It's not a belt, it's not a whip. It's just the thing you use to tie up your trousers, because buttons are for the likes of court officials and barbers with delusions of grandeur. Unstressed, you shuffle toward the door, where you spot the village notice board. Just a nailed-up plank near the well, really. But there it is again. A new law posted in neat, cramped lettering. You blink and squint and finally piece it together. And it's as wonderfully dull as you've come to expect. It seems the Queen's justices have once again clarified the statute regarding ale barrels. According to the latest proclamation, all publicans must now store their ale in casks, marked not only with their initials, but also the specific measurement of each vessel, certified by the local gauger with a heated iron brand. Failure to comply will result in forfeiture of said ale, and possibly a stint in the stocks, though only if the offending cask was offered to paying customers. You let out a tiny laugh through your nose. Only in Elizabethan England could forgetting to burn a number into a barrel become a punishable offense. But here's the truth. Ale is serious business. It's not just a beverage. It's practically food. In fact, children drink it. It's safer than water, more reliable than a wandering priest, and often thicker than the porridge you ate that morning. So the rules around it, no matter how ridiculous they seem, are treated with something close to reverence. You, for instance, know better than to accept a pint from old Mab, the widow who lives 3 cottages down, because she's been fined twice already for watering her brew with pond water. You love a shortcut. But you're not that reckless. What makes this law especially comforting, though, is how much detail it contains. It doesn't just say, don't cheat. It outlines the precise diameter a gallon cask must be at its bilge, the depth from rim to base, the nature of the wood permitted, oak preferably seasoned, and the kind of iron that may be used for banding. No thin strips that snap when a cask is dropped. In an age where plagues can sweep through a village like spilled milk, and tax collectors can show up demanding levies for wars you've never heard of. There's something soothing about knowing exactly how tall a barrel should be. It's not just ale, of course. You begin to remember more of them. These laws that aren't laws so much as sleepy nudges in the ribs from a fussy aunt. There's one about the number of geese a person may walk through the marketplace without being deemed a nuisance to trade. The number is 6, if you're wondering. Another about the precise width of a shoemaker's stall, which according to town ordinance must not exceed 5 feet, lest it encroach upon the space reserved for lawful pedestrian passage. There's even a clause about the ringing of bells. Yes, bells, which must not toll more than thrice per wedding, unless the couple can prove noble birth, or the ceremony includes at least 1 roast swan. You shake your head fondly. It's nonsense, of course, but it's organized nonsense. It's as though the whole country agreed to wrap itself in a warm quilt of bureaucratic fluff, just thick enough to muffle the harsher edges of life. And here's a fringe delight. Some parishes actually compete to enforce these laws with greater enthusiasm than others. You hear stories of constables measuring bread loaves with wooden calipers and clucking disapprovingly if they're a hair too round or a crumb too tall. In Norwich, rumor has it that a baker was once made to stand barefoot on his own flour sack during a sermon as penance for adding salt above the legal threshold. And yes, that's a real thing. There are statutes regulating bread flavor. Apparently, being too tasty can be a crime if it suggests extravagance. You think about your own village and its laws, and despite the occasional absurdity, there's comfort in the routine of them. There's a man in charge of the duck pond. His only duty is to ensure that it doesn't get clogged with laundry runoff or infested with fish of foreign origin, which is not nearly as exciting as it sounds. Then there's the woman appointed to inspect lacework sold at market. She carries a little loop of wire through which she passes every sample, making sure it isn't wider than permitted by sumptuary law. She rarely speaks, but she hums softly and always has a meat pie in her left pocket. The Elizabethan state, you realize, operates not like a great roaring engine, but like a slightly overstuffed clock, ticking away with excessive gears, each one designed to control a part of your life you didn't know needed control. And yet, those little laws are the very things that give your days structure. You follow them not out of fear, but because not following them would mean uncertainty. And in a world where you still wonder whether the next rainfall will drown your carrot patch, certainty is priceless. And so, when the bell rings to signal the start of market hours, no earlier than 9 a.m., no later than 9:15, as per statute, you smile faintly beneath your wool hat. You line up your dried herbs in neat rows, measure your sack of peas twice just to be sure, and glance over at the town crier as he clears his throat to read the day's newest proclamation. Something about chimney sweeps, you think. Something wonderfully, marvelously specific. By mid-afternoon, you've shifted your weight from foot to foot so many times on the uneven stones of the market square that your ankles begin to ache in that familiar, quiet sort of way. Not painful enough to complain about, certainly not painful enough to stop selling your peas, but just enough to remind you that standing still is, somehow, even harder than walking all day. You cast a glance toward the chapel tower, where the sundial's thin shadow now leans just past the 3rd mark. And you know it's nearly time for the constables to start their strolls. Official ones, with batons and slow, measured steps, looking for violations of the day's posted laws. And especially for one of the strangest, the one about idle loitering under public trees. Yes, trees. You wouldn't think they'd require legislative attention. But here in Elizabethan England, even the oaks and chestnuts of the commons are granted a sort of legal personality. Specifically, you're not allowed to dwell excessively beneath them between noon and sunset without a provable reason. Provable being the critical word, of course, and one that opens the door to entire afternoons of whispered debates, muffled laughter, and the occasional fabricated explanation involving lost buttons or philosophical contemplation. Historians still argue whether this law was meant to prevent lazy apprentices from skipping work or to stop secret meetings that might smell of sedition. But either way, you've heard of people fined for lingering with no visible purpose near a tree with known shade. What makes it even better is that some towns, your own included, have gone the extra mile by affixing little carved plaques to the most egregiously shady trees, warning passers-by of the risk of loitering penalties. You imagine the tree itself getting offended. "How dare you rest beneath my limbs?" it might grumble, without a documented excuse and a signed statement from your guildmaster. And yet, despite how silly it all sounds, there's a strange peace in it too. The law, in its roundabout way, is a reminder that your society, for all its fleas and foot rot and famine, is deeply committed to order, even if that order occasionally extends to bark and branches. You stroll past one such tree on your way to the pea cellar, careful to keep walking and not make eye contact with the constable seated on a nearby bench. He isn't actually watching anyone, just scribbling in a leather-bound book that no one's ever seen open. You assume it's full of imagined infractions. Perhaps he's writing, "Saw 3 geese looking suspicious near the churchyard," or "Witnessed a man frown too long at a turnip." Once at the pie stall, you're met with another legal relic, the regulation crust thickness law. Technically, any meat pie sold to the public must have a top crust no thinner than 1/4 of an inch to ensure that bakers aren't cheating customers with underfilled or flimsy products. The rule was supposedly enacted after a scandal in Canterbury involving pigeon pies so delicate they collapsed before reaching the buyer. You can't say for sure if it's true, but you enjoy the image of stern-faced inspectors tapping crusts with wooden rods, listening for the proper echo of integrity. The baker, her hands always dusted in flour, her smile half hidden beneath a kerchief, nods in recognition and lifts a particularly solid-looking pie from the back row. You buy it without question, knowing she's never once been cited for crust violations. She even boasts of it sometimes, half joking, half proud, saying, "Ain't a soul alive's cracked my pastry with a caliper." And there's something incredibly comforting in that, too, knowing that she takes pride in being slightly above the legal minimum. You munch slowly on the pie as you cross the green, where the public stock stand. Not in use today, which is always nice. Though last week, a lad from 2 villages over was locked in them for publicly impersonating a licensed soap seller. Yes, that's a thing. You need a license to sell soap, at least if it's scented or dyed. Supposedly, it protects the public from poorly made batches that might burn the skin or worse, smell too foreign. Lavender is fine, but if it smells vaguely Spanish, that's a matter for the sheriff. And while we're on soap, let's not forget the most wonderfully useless regulation of all, the law that forbids anyone from drying garments on the hedges beside the mayor's house. A hedge, mind you. Not the door, not the walkway, just the hedges. The story goes that a group of overly enthusiastic washerwomen once draped their entire week's laundry on the bushes outside a local official's home, causing such visual disorder that it offended his sense of decorum. Since then, every mayor has upheld the rule as tradition, citing hedge dignity as a matter of civic pride. You wonder briefly what laws might someday be made about your own habits. Would future villagers frown upon your tendency to oversalt your gruel? Would they fine your descendants for walking too quickly around the well? It's a ridiculous thought, but not entirely outlandish. The Elizabethan world, after all, is one that finds comfort in rules, even when the rules are gloriously unnecessary. Later in the afternoon, you wander into the clothier's stall, a place where laws truly bloom like fungi after rain. The sumptuary statutes alone, those governing who can wear what, are vast enough to make your head spin. You can't wear velvet unless you own a certain number of sheep. You may not wear crimson unless you're the child of a knight or above. Gold thread? Only if you've received royal permission in writing. And no, a wax seal from your cousin pretending to be a baron doesn't count. But the oddest of these, and your personal favorite, is the prohibition on excessively bouncy hose. Apparently, a few tailors became overzealous with their padding techniques, giving their clients stockings so inflated they wobbled like jelly. It was a brief fashion trend, quickly squashed by an ordinance that specified no protrusions in the leg or lower codpiece area exceeding a moderate fist in volume. And yes, somewhere in the town hall is likely a wooden carving of the exact size of a moderate fist, kept in a drawer for enforcement purposes. You adjust your own trousers, grateful for their legal compliance, and think once more about the odd comfort of it all. The laws, fussy, overly detailed, sometimes deeply silly, create a framework around your life that is at once restrictive and gently reassuring. In a world where illness can strike overnight and foreign ships loom just beyond the coast, there is a certain magic in knowing that your pies are thick enough, your soap sufficiently bland, and your legs mercifully uninflated. You pass through the churchyard gate with a sort of sluggish amble that befits someone not quite in a rush, but also not eager to be caught idle. Remember that tree lore, after all. Your hand still warm from the pie crust and your thoughts lingering somewhere between crust thickness, regulations, and soap licensing as you glance over the crooked tombstones. A row of them leans forward as if eavesdropping, their mozzie inscriptions barely legible now, half swallowed by damp and time. But even here, amid the solemn quiet of the dead, the long fingers of Elizabethan law had once pried and poked their way in with uncanny precision, drafting statutes for burial practices that left absolutely nothing to chance or to the imagination. You see, during your lifetime, there's a regulation, quietly enforced, rarely mentioned aloud, that requires the gravedigger to ensure the burial depth of each deceased citizen reaches exactly 6 feet. Not 5.5, not a generous 7, but 6. Some say it was about preventing the spread of plague. Others suggest it had to do with discouraging grave robbers by adding a bit of extra elbow grease to the task. Historians, ever at odds, continue to argue whether it was truly about hygiene or just a matter of standardized shoveling. You, however, know that old Mortimer the gravekeeper doesn't even own a ruler. He just eyeballs it, declares with a grunt, "Aye, she's about 6, and pats the earth like a proud baker flattening a dough. What makes this regulation even more curious is the fine print, literally, on vellum parchment inside the church office, that lists exceptions. For instance, if the deceased was under the age of 12 and weighed less than 1.5 stones, the required depth is lowered to 4 feet, which led to a brief but memorable scandal where one unfortunate family attempted to claim their 16-year-old son was small for his age, just to save time. The priest did not find it amusing, but your walk through the churchyard doesn't end there. As you round the rear cloister wall, you're reminded of the law regarding bell ringing. Yes, bell ringing. A fine tradition, certainly, but also one tightly governed by hours, purpose, and tone. Under Queen Elizabeth's rule, you may only ring the bell for officially sanctioned events, deaths, births of noble lineage, fires, if large enough, and oddly, the arrival of unusually large shipments of fish. Anything outside that list is considered ringing without righteous cause and punished by a mandatory day of silence, which, in a village full of market criers, pig callers, and gossiping aunts, is practically a fate worse than stocks. And yet last year, old Geoffrey rang the bell 12 times at dawn because he'd caught a pike as long as his thigh and felt it warranted attention. The constable was summoned, a fine was issued, but the pike, stuffed and mounted, still hangs in Geoffrey's parlour, silently daring future fishermen to outdo him. From there, your journey takes you past the almshouse, where yet another peculiar rule comes to mind, one that governs what kinds of gifts the poor may legally receive. Bread, yes. Ale, in moderation. But no dyed fabric, unless it's in a tone of respectable humility. No bright yellow, no rich crimson, certainly no sky blue, which was once associated with a scandal involving a merchant's apprentice and a bishop's niece. No one talks about it directly, of course, but the law still lingers, like the scent of burnt barley. The women at the almshouse, practical as ever, simply dye all their donations in grey or brown now. It's become almost a style. Poor folk taupe, as one cheeky tailor called it, and somehow, despite the drab hues, they manage to look more put together than the magistrate's wife, who always insists on dressing like a summer melon left out in the rain. You shuffle on, your shoes, worn but technically legal, carrying you to the edge of the green, where the poultry sellers gather. Here lies one of your favorite local enforcement oddities, the Chicken Certification Ordinance. All chickens sold within market bounds must be certified as having no more than 3 toes per foot. Now, this isn't because 4-toed chickens are a threat to the monarchy or anything, though there was once a rumor about a chicken with 5 toes pecking the queen's cousin, but rather because certain breeds with extra toes are said to walk too proudly, which apparently disrupts the natural order of peasant humility. Of course, no one actually inspects the feet. Everyone just nods seriously and says, "Oh yes, very 3-toed, madam," and moves on. But somewhere in the mayor's office is a leather-bound booklet titled Standard Poultry Limb Expectations, filled with detailed illustrations of fowl anatomy, lovingly annotated in looping script by someone who definitely had too much time and a disturbing interest in chicken legs. As you reach the communal well, you pause for a drink, just a sip, careful not to violate the excessive drawing of public water statute, which limits each citizen to 2 full buckets per day, unless an exception is granted due to thirst of notable origin. The origin part is crucial. It must be notable. Being warm? Not notable. Being faint from carrying 12 sacks of potatoes uphill in July while wearing wool? Possibly notable, but only if witnessed by someone from the clergy. There's something beautiful in all this, you think, as you let the cool water wet your lips. These laws, odd as they are, wrap themselves around your world like a patchwork quilt. Not particularly elegant, not always logical, but oddly comforting nonetheless. You live among rules that care about trees and crusts and fowl digits, a society that pauses to regulate color and water, and the dimensions of hose can't be all bad. It may be cracked and confused and comically overregulated, but it is home. And even as the sky darkens, casting long shadows over the cobbles, you know that somewhere, not far from here, a scribe is copying one of these laws onto fresh parchment by candlelight, the tip of his quill catching slightly with each loop, each curve, each absurdly specific decree designed to protect you from scandalous soap or unruly poultry. You continue past the edge of the green, where a light wind begins to flutter the corners of a few official notices pinned to the side of the baker's stable. Though calling it a stable is generous, as it holds neither horse nor mule, but instead a deeply judgmental goat named Agnes, who has witnessed at least 3 illicit market trades and 1 unfortunate wedding proposal gone terribly wrong. Here, a small parchment flaps lazily beneath a crooked nail, its ink only half faded, reminding all townspeople of one of Elizabethan England's most uniquely petty but meticulously enforced laws: the standard window transparency and gossip regulation, which, in plain terms, tells you how clean your windows must be if your home faces the road. The logic, such as it is, seems rooted in the idea that excessively dirty windows imply secrets. Secrets invite curiosity. Curiosity leads to speculation. And speculation, in Elizabethan law, is basically treason with better manners. If your windows are too clean, however, you're obviously trying to show off. And that too is punishable. If not by fine, then by the slow sting of social shame, which is far worse than any coin extracted by the constable. Naturally, you walk a fine line. Your windows are wiped once every fortnight, never gleaming, never dull, always maintained at the precise level of mildly transparent with honest streaks, the way your mother taught you before she was fined in '72 for excessive polishing during Lent. She still complains about that ticket. As you shuffle along the main road, your eye catches sight of the tailor's shop, where another curious law once stirred great confusion: the regulation of sleeve width. Yes, sleeves. The outer arms of clothing. During the height of Queen Elizabeth's reign, citizens were classified, officially, mind you, according to their social rank and income, and accordingly permitted to wear sleeves of certain maximum widths. A gentleman of moderate standing might sport sleeves no wider than a goose's neck, while nobility were granted the glory of sleeves reaching the span of a small barn owl's wingspan. Your own sleeves, of course, are modest, functional, and distinctly compliant. But once, during a particularly festive harvest celebration, you borrowed a doublet from your cousin, who fancied himself rather grander than he was, and whose sleeves had pleats so exuberantly puffy they nearly knocked over a candle on the buffet table. That night ended with a firm tap on the shoulder from the town's fashion inspector. Yes, there was such a person. And a stern warning to deflate or be fined. You deflated, dramatically, but the rules didn't stop at garments. No, they extended into the very fabric of your speech, especially if you were in the service of a noble household. You may recall the utterance formality clause, a rarely invoked but deeply feared provision that dictated, under specific circumstances, the phrasing of greetings and farewells. It is not enough to say good morrow if you're addressing someone 2 tiers above your social standing. You must instead say, "My lord, the dawn brings favor to your countenance." And if you forget, as you often do before your first mug of barley tea, the appropriate correction is a low bow and a mumbled reference to the weather. This rule was reportedly introduced to curb vulgar brevity, a term that makes very little sense, until you recall that one of the Queen's cousins once overheard a stable boy say "shh" and fainted on the spot. You turn the corner and pass by the apothecary's window, where dried herbs hang in careful clusters, and a small wooden placard reminds visitors that ointments may not be sold on Whitsun. That's right. There exists a whole category of Elizabethan law that regulates when and how substances can be purchased, particularly tonics, balms, and other preparations of medicinal or questionable value. On certain holidays, you see, it is considered improper to purchase anything that implies bodily suffering. The idea is that one must be joyful in spirit and sound in constitution on days marked by religious celebration, even if, say, you have a raging toothache or a rash that resembles the outline of Wales. You once tried to purchase a bottle of mint water for your cousin's stomach gripes on Easter Monday, and were met with the most scandalized gasp you've heard. Since that time, Lady Winscomb's turkeys escaped into the chapel. The apothecary, a man of stern convictions and wildly inconsistent pricing, simply turned his sign around to read, "Closed, due to public piety," and pointed at it with exaggerated solemnity. Beyond him lies the cooper's shop, which brings to mind one of the most obscure but comforting regulations of all, the Barrel Integrity Act. Under this law, all barrels produced within the boundaries of the parish must undergo a visual inspection and a tap test by the barrel warden, yet another official position whose duties include knocking on wood and writing sternly worded reports about leakage. It's a ridiculous job, truly. But you once watched the warden, a short man named Thomas, who wore his hat like it owed him rent, lean in close to a half-finished barrel and whisper, "You'd better not betray me." Then he knocked 3 times, nodded slowly, and recorded something in his ledger with the gravitas of a court judge. What's more, the law specifies that barrels must not only be watertight, but respectfully stained. No bright dyes, no elaborate carvings, just clean, understated wood, ideally smelling faintly of toast and virtue. The reasoning, if you can call it that, was to discourage showy beer merchants from flaunting their goods with barrels more fashionable than the Queen's wigs. Historians continue to debate whether this regulation was about class control or simply barrel-based jealousy. But the consensus is that it was enforced with surprising zeal in the eastern counties. Now, as you meander towards the edge of town, where the cobbles give way to gravel, you pass by a modest wooden bench. Legal, of course, only because it meets the precise dimensions specified in the Public Seating Ordinance. Benches must be low enough to discourage reclining, yet high enough to allow for conversational dignity. They must also be made of local timber, preferably from trees not under protection by the Elm Admiration Law, which you may recall prevents the cutting of any elm that has survived more than 2 winters with visible moss and at least one romantic tale attached to it. The bench creaks as you sit, your knees aching slightly, your sleeves well-behaved, your gossip withheld, your bucket ration honored, your windows appropriately smeared, and you marvel, not for the first time, at how you've managed to live your entire life within the watchful, bureaucratic embrace of Elizabethan legality, and you wouldn't have it any other way. You rise from the bench with the slow, deliberate grace of someone who knows that even sitting too quickly might attract the attention of a passing constable with nothing better to do. And as your feet shuffle back into the gravel, you glance toward the distant silhouettes of village fences, those weather-beaten partitions that, believe it or not, are yet another relic of the endlessly detailed and oddly comforting laws of Elizabethan England. For in those days, even your hedges and your wooden slats were subject to regulation, particularly under the quaintly titled Neighbourly Boundaries Act, which stated, with delightful formality, that no fence shall exceed a height that would impede the communal gossip of two adjoining households standing upright on their respective sides. And really, what could be more Elizabethan than enshrining chit-chat into legal code? The official justification, of course, was to promote visibility, fairness of sunlight, and the free exchange of domestic alarms, which was code for being able to spot your neighbor's burning laundry line before the flames reached your chicken coop. But everyone knew that the real reason lay in maintaining that gentle rhythm of whispered updates about who's courting whom, who's adding suspicious quantities of garlic to their stews, and whose pig has mysteriously taken to staring at the churchyard during storms. The local magistrate, a rotund man with a powdered nose and a fondness for apricot tarts, was known to carry a specially measured stick, his gossip gauge. And if a fence appeared even slightly too tall, he would pace beside it solemnly, hold up the rod and pronounce, "This hedge stifles truth." The offending family would then be instructed to trim precisely 3 inches and offer a mild apology to the neighbors, even if the neighbors had no idea there was a problem in the first place. As you amble past these legal fences, your thoughts turn toward another everyday ritual of village life that naturally required legislative oversight: bread. The assize of bread and ale, an older statute still enforced with quiet pride in Elizabethan times, dictated not only the price of loaves, but their precise weight, and curiously, the attitude with which they were sold. Yes, the law recommended that bakers maintain a temper of honest hospitality while conducting their transactions, and a frown at the counter could cost you more than a shilling. It could cost you your reputation. You remember once watching old Mistress Tata, the village's most formidable breadmonger, weigh a loaf with the intensity of a general reviewing battle plans, her scale trembling as she added a shaving more dough to meet the mandated measure. She would never dare short a loaf, not just because of the law, but because she feared the wrath of the bread warden, a minor official with a velvet cap and an uncanny ability to appear whenever a roll looked suspiciously underbaked. His entrance was always preceded by the rustling of parchment and the clearing of his throat, ominous sounds in the quiet corridors of flowery justice. But it wasn't just the bread that came under scrutiny. Ale, too, had its champions and its limitations. Brewing was a revered domestic craft, often done in the home by women, and the laws took pains to ensure that the strength of the ale remained within socially acceptable boundaries. Too weak, and it was a con. Too strong, and it was a hazard. And if it caused a man to fall into a pig pen or sing psalms backwards in the street, well, then you'd be facing the dreaded drunken penance board, which mostly consisted of your neighbors making disappointed faces until you apologized and promised to switch to cider. Further on, you reach the village green, where the sight of a solitary goose waddling with inexplicable determination reminds you of yet another law. This one concerning animals, particularly pigs, geese, and other creatures likely to interfere with public decency or church processionals. There was, believe it or not, a statute that forbade livestock from entering any building that had once been blessed, which included chapels, schools, and quite memorably, the home of Miss Havers, who had her kitchen sanctified after a particularly spiritual goose-related incident. But enforcement of this law was inconsistent, owing to the notorious difficulty of arresting a goat with intent. Instead, if an animal transgressed, the responsibility fell upon the owner, who was required to perform a series of small acts of public restitution, such as scrubbing the village well or reciting a psalm backward in the town square while wearing a wreath of parsley. The idea was that shame, rather than punishment, would encourage better livestock management, although it did very little to deter Agnes, the goat, from slipping into the scribe's office on Thursdays and eating precisely one ink bottle before sauntering out with no remorse. Your shoes crunch softly over the gravel as you make your way toward the well itself, an ancient stone basin reinforced with iron hoops and an official plaque declaring it lawfully circular since 1543. This is no joke. Wells, too, came under the gaze of Elizabethan lawmakers who decreed that the public water source must be of pleasing symmetry, clear depth, and, this is true, free of ominous echoes. If your well echoed too dramatically, people might begin to suspect it was haunted or cursed or, worst of all, improperly blessed. So once a year, usually during the spring thaw, the village would hold its well calibration festival, a name far more exciting than the event itself, which mostly involved dropping pebbles, humming near the rim, and nodding with relief if the splash sounded honest. You, of course, always volunteered, mostly for the spiced cider and the opportunity to wear your ceremonial ribbon, which was really just a sock-dyed blue and pinned to your tunic. By now, you've wandered back to the edge of the market square, where a small cart sells turnips, arranged in strict descending size order. This is not a preference, it is the law. Root vegetables displayed for public sale must, according to the Produce Modesty Clause, be sorted by either size, shade, or root orientation, but never all three. This clause was famously created after the Great Parsnip Debate of 1589, in which an ambitious farmer arranged his wares into the shape of Queen Elizabeth's profile and accidentally offended half the parish council. Since then, turnips have been watched closely. And with that thought, you feel the faintest breeze of evening roll in, catching the edge of your sleeve, appropriately narrow, socially compliant, and reminding you that there's likely a parchment posted somewhere, reminding you that the evening bell rings in exactly 16 minutes, and that all citizens must begin their diminished visibility protocol, which basically means you have to carry a lantern, walk at reduced speed, and not shout about pudding near alleyways. That's the Elizabethan way. You follow the soft, uneven path along the outer hedgerow now, tracing with your fingertips the jagged, ivy-woven wood that marks the legal edge of Farmer Tolliver's land. A man once fined 2 shillings for allowing his pumpkins to trespass. And as you walk, your mind drifts toward one of the most comforting, if slightly maddening, aspects of life under Elizabethan law. The regulation of clothing, and not for protection or decency, mind you, but for class distinction, a topic so thoroughly legislated that even the button on your sleeve could be cause for royal concern. Indeed, the sumptuary laws, those curious, colorful dictates that told you what you were allowed to wear based on your social status, were as much a part of your daily life as your shoes or your turnips, assuming you were fortunate enough to afford either. And while it might seem quaint or even amusing now, in the moment, these laws were treated with solemn importance, partly because the government genuinely believed that unregulated fashion could lead to social collapse, and partially because, well, Queen Elizabeth had a personal aversion to seeing silk on people she deemed spiritually unprepared for it. You, being of modest birth and uncertain lineage, are allowed wool, naturally, and linen if it isn't too white, but you must avoid velvet entirely, unless it is affixed only to a hatband and accompanied by a visible symbol of your trade. Something like a thimble if you're a tailor, or a tiny wooden spoon if you're part of the increasingly suspicious custard guild. Bright crimson is reserved for nobility, deep violet for clergy, and anything embroidered with real gold thread could get you summoned to the guild hall. But a very serious man with exceptionally long fingernails might ask you to recite your great-grandfather's occupation before deciding whether or not to confiscate your doublet. The law went so far as to define who could wear feathers in their caps, how many inches a sleeve might puff, and, most delightfully, what types of lace were permissible on socks. One obscure entry stated that lace of foreign lands shall not embrace the calves of an unmarried cooper under 40, which raises far more questions than it answers. But you suppose someone, somewhere, laced a leg inappropriately, and the Queen noticed. Of course, enforcement varied. In the cities, you might be stopped by a watchman with an eye for embroidery. In the country, enforcement fell to the parish priest, who would gently point out during his sermon that someone among the congregation had arrived in an unlawfully flashy jerkin, and that this sort of behavior invited theological confusion and poor harvests. But sometimes the laws got it backward. There's the tale of little Elsie, a goatherd's daughter who accidentally inherited a noblewoman's cloak after a cart mishap at the market. For 3 glorious days, she wore it, hood up, nose high, moving like she owned the manor, until the village tailor, unable to stand the visual inconsistency, reported her. The cloak was removed with ceremony and replaced with a shawl of undetermined fiber. But the local boys continued to call her Lady Elsie for the rest of her life, mostly out of admiration, but partly to annoy the tailor. Clothing aside, another law you'd be keenly aware of, especially on your walks around the village perimeter, is the one regarding dogs. More specifically, dog barking. Yes, according to the Canine Serenity Edict, passed during a particularly windy spring when the Queen's own spaniel developed what the court physician called earthwitch. Any dog found barking after dusk 3 nights in a row could be subject to muzzling, relocation, or, in particularly persistent cases, sent to live with monks who specialized in pet rehabilitation through hymn exposure. You, having raised a particularly nervous terrier named Niblet, learned to sing soft lullabies at dusk, just to keep her calm and quiet until morning. The local warden once caught you mid-serenade and nodded approvingly, muttering something about civic harmony. Meanwhile, Niblet stared at him and promptly sneezed on his shoe. Speaking of civic harmony, you eventually reach the quiet corner of the village square, where the stocks stand, not out of cruelty, but tradition. And it's here that the law's performative side becomes most visible. For in Elizabethan England, justice was often about public display, not prison bars. And the stocks, with their gently splintered wood and faint scent of cabbage, were less a tool of punishment and more a reminder that everyone, even the baker's cousin or the bishop's page, could find themselves briefly immobilized for selling milk with improper froth or misquoting scripture at market. You never ended up in the stocks yourself, though once you did volunteer to oil the hinges after old man Blight got his foot stuck and had to be rescued by a chicken, which in itself became an event, chronicled in local song and commemorated with a bread sculpture at Harvest Festival. There were laws, too, about apologies. If you insulted someone in public, especially near the church or during market hours, you were legally obligated to offer a rectifying gesture, which usually meant a spoken apology while holding a daisy, or, in more dramatic cases, performing a short poem about regret near the duck pond. The duck pond became quite a popular venue, attracting spectators who brought pastries and rated the performances. A particularly emotional apology once caused a fishmonger to faint from empathy. Even love was regulated, gently and from a distance, through betrothal oaths and the pre-union compatibility prayer, a legal ritual involving 3 candles, 2 onions, and a verse from Leviticus. These ceremonies were often led by the village notary, who also served as beekeeper and amateur trumpet enthusiast, making his readings slightly less sacred and slightly more nasal than intended. You pause for a moment now, leaning against the cool stone of the chapel wall, its ivy-clad surface bearing witness to centuries of whispered confessions and possibly illegal hat feathers. You think about how the laws, for all their strangeness, gave structure to a world that could so easily unravel with too much ambition or too little patience. Odd, yes, arbitrary often, but comforting too, because when you live in a world where even the lace on your socks is watched over by ancient decree, you begin to feel that someone, somewhere, however dusty and bureaucratic, is paying attention. You brush a fingertip along the rim of a weather-worn wooden bench in the center of the parish green, letting your gaze drift lazily toward the small notice board beside the church door. Its curling parchment corners flapping slightly in the breeze, revealing lists and rules that have likely remained unchanged for decades. And as your eyes adjust to the neat, slanted ink, you remember one of the more peculiar Elizabethan fixations, regulating the hours when you were legally allowed to do absolutely nothing at all. That's right. While modern schedules obsess over productivity and calendars chop with reminders to stand up, breathe, drink water, or complete tasks before the top of the hour, Elizabethan England preferred a different kind of structure, one that legally defined when you could rest, when you could loiter, when you were allowed to nap in public view without being accused of vagrancy, and even, delightfully, when you could gossip. There was, for instance, the so-called idle hour, an unspoken but semi-enforced understanding that between the ringing of the third bell, past noon, and the fourth crow of the constable's rooster, one might lean against a shaded wall, sit on a barrel, or stretch out beneath an obliging hedge, with no need to justify one's apparent lack of movement to anyone, so long as one's shoes remained on and one's mouth didn't open too wide during snoring. You remember many such afternoons, sprawled out near the blacksmith's stable, your eyes half closed, fingers twirling a bit of straw, while distant hammering and the occasional bleat from an irritated sheep served as your lullaby. Occasionally, someone would pass by and nod respectfully, murmuring something like, "Good use of the law," or in less generous tones, "He's rehearsing for the afterlife already." The law that permitted this loafing was tied loosely to agricultural rhythms and local custom, but it had real teeth during harvest season, when landowners were desperate to squeeze every last kernel from the fields, and therefore restricted napping to specific windows. If you slept too early, you might be fined a halfpenny. If you overslept into the church bell's evening call, you risked being classified as a willful indolent, which sounded dramatic, but mostly meant you'd be asked to sweep the tavern's yard while everyone watched. Of course, the law also dictated how long someone could talk before being interrupted. In Elizabethan villages, conversation wasn't just a social lubricant, it was a potential powder keg. And so, local rules emerged that governed everything from tone to tempo. The tail-length ordinance, for example, advised that a public anecdote should not exceed the time it takes a candle stub to melt down a thumb's width, which roughly equates to 3 minutes, assuming mild wind and decent beeswax. This law was largely ignored by elders, poets, and butchers with romantic troubles, but it was strictly enforced at baptism feasts, where the stakes were oddly high and the cider free-flowing. You once witnessed a neighbor, Widow Pash, scolded mid-parable by the alley-keeper's apprentice for exceeding the candle, which prompted a wave of applause from those who'd heard her story about a haunted wheelbarrow 5 times already that month. Another delightfully specific law involved the curfew for laughter. Yes, according to a particularly Ernestown ordinance, posted in 1592, excessive merriment after sundown was discouraged near almshouses, where the elderly and infirm were said to be vulnerable to sudden bursts of mirth-induced disorientation. The law did not prohibit laughter outright, but requested that it be gently stifled or redirected into one's collar, a phrase so curious you once attempted to comply by giggling into your shirt, only to be asked by a passing friar whether you were choking on a parsnip. Despite its silliness, the rule had its defenders. The mayor claimed it helped maintain nocturnal serenity, while the village healer noted a decrease in startled hiccups among her patients. But mostly, it just gave people an excuse to invent a whole new language of silent comedy, exaggerated eyebrow lifts, dramatic gasps, expressive hand flutters that turned the lanes into a kind of pantomime theater every evening after 8. You especially remember a baker named Hob, who mastered the art of silent laughter so thoroughly he could make a child snort milk by blinking in sequence. He became a minor celebrity, until he blinked out of order and caused a goat stampede, which led to the temporary suspension of all facial-based humor near livestock. Meanwhile, the law regulating resting postures, known as the Spine Alignment Edict, forbade napping with one's knees higher than one's ears in public spaces, as it was believed such positions invited spiritual confusion and unwelcome dreams. A local priest once warned that sleeping folded like a purse tempts the devil to make change within you, which sounded ominous, though no one could really explain what it meant. He once tested the rule by curling up near the mill pond in an impressively compact shape. You woke to find a goose pecking your elbow and a note beside your boot that read simply, "Temptation denied." Elsewhere, the so-called bench law stated that anyone sitting on a public bench for more than 30 minutes without shifting position must either share a story, offer a boiled sweet, or sing the refrain from the town's unofficial song, which featured exactly 9 verses and a suspicious number of references to chimney soot. You always kept a mint in your pocket, just in case. But perhaps your favorite idle time law was the one that defined productive dawdling. If you could plausibly claim that your inactivity involved mental sketching of civic improvements, you were immune from complaint for a full hour. Thus, if accused of wasting time, you simply nodded sagely and said, "Considering improvements to the eastern drainage, even if your true focus was the pattern of moss on your boots, it wasn't just clever, it was legal." Oddly enough, these idling laws created a strange kind of balance in your day. Bursts of work punctuated by sanctioned stillness, gossip with rules, laughter on a timer, and naps that flirted with theological boundaries. You never felt quite free exactly, but you also never felt adrift. Everything had a time, a texture, and a threshold, like living inside a very polite clock. And when someone overstepped, talked too long, laughed too loud, napped in an odd angle, the correction was rarely harsh. Sometimes a note would appear in your pocket, written in cheerful ink. "Dear friend, your feet exceeded regulation during the noon rest. Kindly tuck." Other times, the town crier would mention it gently while announcing cheese prices. 3 wheels for a penny, and a gentle reminder not to slouch in proximity to the ladies' rose garden. You smile now, remembering it all. The rules, the loopholes, the honest enforcement of behavior that, in truth, caused no real harm but gave everyone something to nod about, whisper over, or pretend to care deeply for, just to feel more important. There's comfort in that. And perhaps, just perhaps, it's nice to live in a world where even doing nothing is subject to the law, because then even your stillness feels meaningful. You lean your elbow against the chipped wooden ledge of the town's communal bread oven, its stones still warm from the dawn baking, and your eye lingers on the sign nailed just above its arch, weather-faded, yet still legible in its insistence. By order of the guild, bread may not be too fluffy. And yes, you do a double take every time, as if hoping you've misunderstood the wording or misread the archaism. But no, the law is quite firm on the matter. Under Queen Elizabeth's reign, your daily loaf was legally required to possess a certain firmness. The statute, tucked in among the more severe proclamations about treason and highwaymen, made it clear that bread too light, too airy, or too large in appearance without corresponding weight could be considered fraudulent. The law wasn't about culinary taste. It was about trust. Bread, you see, was the currency of the common stomach, and cheating a villager of their fair share of dough was considered almost as bad as stealing a pig. Well, perhaps not quite that bad, but close enough to earn a scolding and possibly a dunk in the public pond, which, as you know, was less refreshing than it sounds. So you'd often spot the baker squinting suspiciously at his own loaves, giving them a test squeeze, a judgmental prod, or, on bold mornings, placing them on the village scales next to a regulation stone. If the bread came up light, even by a mere ounce, out it went, tossed to the chickens, or donated to the monastery where the friars didn't mind a bit of deception, so long as it was blessed. And let's not even start on the dreaded bread inspection hour, where a local clerk, usually the grocer's brother-in-law or the retired barrel maker with too much time, would walk from shop to shop with a carved stick exactly 6 inches long, known as the loaf gauge, poking and measuring baked goods like they were unruly schoolchildren. If your crust flaked too proudly, or your crumb had the gall to stretch above its station, you risked a citation on parchment and a warning: rebake by morning, or be fined a groat. You took these things seriously. After all, bad bread law could ruin a perfectly good afternoon. But it wasn't just baked goods that came under legal scrutiny in Elizabethan England. Cheese, of course, had its own complex set of rules. Because what is a sleepy story without a tale of fermented curds? A proper wheel of cheese had to be aged appropriately, labeled with its parish origin, and, perhaps most oddly, must not squeak when cut. That's right. If a wedge emitted a suspicious squeak under the knife, it was seen not as a sign of freshness, but as a possible symptom of foul curdling or improper salting, both offenses punishable by confiscation and mandatory dairy retraining. You once witnessed a cheese merchant furiously whispering apologies to a wheel of cheddar after it betrayed him with a sharp chirp before the market judge. He was ordered to spend the next 2 weeks stirring vats under the watchful eye of Mistress Tansley, a woman so stern her apron had pleats of its own volition. These kinds of laws, the anti-fluff statute, the cheese squeak clause, may sound bizarre to modern ears, but they weren't created from whimsy. They were, in their way, a form of economic justice, attempting to prevent those with power or production means from taking advantage of those who had nothing but coin and trust. If a baker sold air instead of substance, the townsfolk went hungry. If a cheesemaker rushed a batch, stomachs turned and blame flew like pigeons startled from a steeple. Still, you chuckle, remembering how villagers would test these laws with mischief. One boy once baked a loaf entirely hollow, then filled it with feathers and claimed it was a cloud loaf, a seasonal delicacy from Cornwall. It fooled 3 magistrates and a bishop before the feathers escaped during slicing, and the resulting sneeze caused a near duel. The boy was fined a halfpenny, but gained legendary status, and curiously, a marriage proposal from the miller's niece. Then there was the ale standard, perhaps the most beloved and disputed of Elizabethan laws. By decree, ale had to be of honest strength, which meant neither so weak that it tasted like river rinse, nor so potent that it encouraged impromptu hymn singing or overly confident poetry recitals. You knew the tavern keeper, Osric, quite well. He often joked that if your drink made you shout before your third sip, it was unlawful. Yet if it didn't make you sigh by the fourth, it was equally criminal. So taverns posted signs with symbols, a tipped jug, a sleepy dog, a winking sun, that told regulars exactly what kind of evening to expect. 1 jug meant mild and contemplative. 2 meant musical and perhaps a little risky. 3 jugs? That was forget where you left your hose territory. The constable would perform spot checks, ordering a mug and sniffing it with exaggerated suspicion before declaring, aye, lawful, or borderlining mischief. There was one occasion when Osric served a guest something so strong it made his mustache retreat into his mouth. The tavern was briefly closed and reopened with a new floor, made entirely of straw. For future damage control, you glance now at your own hands, impossibly familiar, calloused in memory from years of pressing dough, lifting barrels, slicing cheese, swatting feathers, and passing mugs with practiced ease. You think of how strange it was that so many laws, so many official declarations and town meetings and scribbled proclamations were dedicated not to war or taxes or treason, but to the precise weight of a loaf or the acceptable flavor of a cheese rind. And yet, wasn't there something comforting in that? Something profoundly ordinary? While kings plotted and fleets sailed and borders shifted, your village focused on what mattered most. That food be fair, drink be safe, and no one be cheated out of their rightful crust. You lie back now against the grassy slope, full-bellied with memory and the aftertaste of nostalgia, hearing distant bells, perhaps imagined, perhaps real, signaling the end of the market day. Tomorrow you'll check your bread for fluff again, just in case. You wake slowly, or at least you think you do. Though it's hard to tell in this peculiar place between sleep and law books. Your limbs already stiff from the imagined effort of trudging once more through Elizabethan England's legal landscape. And just as you think it might be safe to drift further, something shuffles at the edge of your mind. The unmistakable scrape of a wooden pew, the creak of a tall hat being removed, and the deep silence that comes only when every villager is pretending not to judge everyone else for how they're sitting. That's right. It's time for church seating laws, and you're about to discover that even where you sat to pray had legal consequences. Yes. If you were born a villager in late 16th century England, your bottom's resting place during Sunday service wasn't simply a matter of comfort or personal preference. It was a public declaration of social hierarchy, a legally enforced seating chart that made sure everyone in town knew exactly how unimportant they were. These seating arrangements were recorded in documents called churchwardens' accounts and revised regularly to reflect marriages, deaths, land acquisitions, or the minor disgrace of sneezing during the bishop's sermon. One family might rise in the ranks after donating candles or tiles to the parish. Another might plummet due to scandal involving an improperly parked ox or a poorly behaved goose at last year's fair. And yes, you could appeal your seating position in court. Imagine walking into a wood-paneled chamber to argue, in full solemnity, that your family's place on the left aisle fourth bench was wholly inadequate, given your cousin's recent marriage to a moderately prosperous fishmonger. These were called pew disputes, and they clogged local court rolls with alarming frequency, with pages upon pages devoted to determining whether Mistress Hargrave had usurped her neighbour's rightful place near the pulpit, or whether Master Dobbins had once again shifted forward by stealth. Now you, bless your humble soul, were usually content with your assigned bench, though it creaked alarmingly, and the family beside you had a child with the curious habit of whistling during psalms. You wore your best wool doublet, freshly brushed and barely itchy, and held your book of common prayer with the seriousness of a diplomat holding a peace treaty, even though you still turned the pages with licked fingers, which your aunt said was scandalously uncouth. The seating laws weren't just about class. They were about keeping the peace in a time when peace was fragile. If someone of lesser rank sat ahead of a gentlewoman, chaos could erupt. There was one case in Norfolk where a merchant's wife sat a full bench ahead of her knight's daughter, and the resulting legal brawl lasted 3 years, involved 4 bishops, and caused 2 sermons to be cancelled due to general outrage and sore throats. And in some parishes, those found repeatedly violating pew order could be punished with reseating in the back next to the tithing man, whose job was to poke sleepers with a long stick. So yes, public shame and gentle violence were both part of the ecclesiastical toolkit, but seating wasn't limited to churches. In theatres, yes, the very places where Shakespeare's lines once echoed off the timber rafters, you had a different kind of spatial drama. While the groundlings stood shoulder to shoulder, sweating and shouting, the well-to-do paid extra to sit in balconies, not necessarily for a better view, but for the chance to be seen watching. The Queen herself had laws enacted about theatre decorum, including who could sit near whom and how much clapping was deemed excessive. There were even rules against wearing overly ruffled collars, since they obstructed the view of others. One nobleman was allegedly fined for having a collar so wide it disrupted Act 2 of Hamlet. You, of course, would have stood with the groundlings, hat in hand, listening raptly, elbowing your way to the front when you could. Once, you dropped a turnip and watched in slow horror as it rolled across the muddy floor and was picked up, sniffed, and pocketed by a child who mistook it for lost treasure. But you stayed put, because even standing had its rules. Certain zones were considered quiet standing, while others were more raucous, and everyone knew better than to lean against the support posts, especially after the unfortunate splinter incident of 1592, which became a cautionary tale for schoolchildren and drunkards alike. Then at the tavern, your old stomping ground, seating was governed less by law and more by custom, which, in Elizabethan England, was often more binding than statute. The stool by the fire belonged to old Bramble, unless he was dead, again, in which case it passed temporarily to the town's oldest widow until the fire died down or she nodded off. There were unspoken agreements, decades in the making, about which table was for dice players, which for card readers, which for gossiping mothers, and which for the poet who always wrote his verses backwards for mystery. Still, You once got into trouble for sitting in the wrong corner during Whitsun. Not real trouble, mind you. Just the kind where someone clears their throat ominously until your soul shrivels and you move voluntarily, apologizing with your eyebrows. A subtle gesture, but one enshrined in social contract and passive-aggressive glances. Now, there's something quite touching about all this. Laws about sitting, about who gets to be where and why, about the etiquette of elbows and the politics of padding. It suggests a world in which position, even in stillness, mattered, where order was not just in the marketplace or the court, but in the places where people gathered, knelt, whispered, listened, and passed the time together. So as you lean back now, somewhere between the chapel and the tavern, between the benches of memory and the cushions of imagination, you marvel not at the severity of the laws, but at their all-hot gentleness. They didn't ask you to fight or labor or proclaim, only to sit properly, to keep your posture dignified, and to remember your place, not as punishment, but as part of the sleepy clockwork of a society trying clumsily and earnestly to function. You sigh, one more law upheld by your bottom, and just as you settle deeper into the imagined worn wood of that creaky church bench, your knees stiff, your hands tucked demurely in your lap, your hat politely off, you begin to wonder what happened when people didn't show up to be seated at all. Because in Elizabethan England, it wasn't enough to have a seat waiting for you. You were actually required by law to put your behind in it. That's right. Attendance at church wasn't just expected. It was mandated, tracked, and if necessary, punished. The law of compulsory church attendance meant that if you didn't appear on Sunday morning, and let's be honest, maybe you had a headache, maybe you'd overindulged in spiced mead the night before, or maybe your boots had finally given up in the mud. Well, someone was going to notice. It wasn't just the vicar who kept track, although he certainly did, often with suspiciously keen eyesight and a memory that seemed to improve when tithes were overdue. No, it was the parish constable and the church wardens who were tasked with keeping an eye on who came and who didn't. If you skipped service more than a few times, you could be fined 12 pence, roughly a week's wages for a labourer. Or, if you were particularly stubborn or dramatic about it, you might find yourself summoned to the local ecclesiastical court, where the most terrifying punishment of all awaited: being publicly admonished. Not flogged, not imprisoned, not burned, just thoroughly and boringly scolded in front of your peers, which, let's be honest, could feel worse than all three combined, especially when your neighbour Agnes muttered, "I knew he was a layabout," loud enough for the whole village to hear. So yes, church attendance was your civic duty. You trotted down muddy lanes in all weathers, wrapped in your scratchiest wool cloak, rain dripping off your nose. Also, you could sit still for hours on a pew that somehow managed to tilt slightly sideways, no matter how it was shimmed. You listened to sermons about eternal damnation, delivered in a tone so dry it could absorb spilled ale. You nodded solemnly during the readings, even when you didn't understand half the words. You tried not to cough too loudly, and you definitely didn't bring up the time the parson sneezed during the Lord's Prayer. Out of respect, of course. But suppose you really didn't want to go. Some tried sneaking away, claiming illness, distant relatives, or sudden, overwhelming need to repair the pig pen. There were even rare, wild souls who fled to the woods, hoping to dodge detection until Monday. Unfortunately for them, Elizabethan neighbors were vigilant creatures, and more than one truancy report began with, "I saw Thomas in the field with his sheep and not in pew number 6, as is fitting for a man of his standing and occupation." And then there were the recusants. Ah, yes, the term you'd have wished to avoid. Those who persistently refused to attend the Church of England's services, often out of religious conviction, especially Catholics, who remained loyal to the old ways. For them, skipping church wasn't just laziness. It was a political act, and one with teeth. Recusants faced steep fines, property seizure, and in some cases, exile. If you were unlucky enough to be labeled as such, your home might be searched for illegal rosaries or forbidden Latin prayer books, and your dinner conversations would become noticeably tenser. You weren't one of them, of course. No, you were just an occasionally drowsy villager who preferred sleeping in on wet Sundays and maybe humming old Catholic hymns under your breath when no one was listening. But nothing scandalous. Certainly not enough to attract the Queen's wrath or the attention of that one churchwarden who always smelled faintly of onions and disappointment. Oddly, even the punishments for skipping church had their own rules. You couldn't just be fined willy-nilly. There were proper forms to be filled out, testimonies to be collected, and at least 3 elders had to agree that you weren't off on legitimate business. If you were a servant and your master excused your absence, that was acceptable. If you were in labor, the painful kind, not the legal kind, that was also excusable. But if you were caught lounging near the river, tossing pebbles, skipping stones, or, heaven forbid, playing cards, well, now you were courting not only social ruin, but also the dreaded label of Sabbath breaker. And Sabbath breaking was no small matter. It included such offenses as whistling, unnecessary smiling, wearing overly bright colors, and excessive loafing. There was even a village where a boy was whipped, not harshly, more ceremonially, for skipping stones on the holy day. The boy, ever resilient, later became the parish's best stone skipper and was rumored to hold the record for the longest bounce across the duck pond. Though this was never officially recorded due to obvious theological concerns. But perhaps the strangest twist in this tale of enforced piety is that some people genuinely enjoyed the pressure. Church was their one social event of the week, their chance to parade new bonnets, eye their crushes across the aisle, and engage in thrilling post-sermon discussions about who coughed during which psalm. A missed Sunday meant missed gossip, missed fashion, missed chance to be spotted by the widowed apothecary whose chin had recently recovered from a shaving mishap. It wasn't all punishment and rules. It was also pageantry, a slow, theatrical ritual that grounded your week, soothed your anxieties, and occasionally made you feel like you belonged. So you kept going, week after week. Your boots wore a groove in the road from your cottage to the chapel. Your hair flattened into a permanent cap shape. Your legs adapted to the angle of the pew. and your ears learn to filter out the creaking sigh of the organ bellows. And like clockwork, you avoided fines, survived scoldings, and secured your place, both in your community and in the great, sleepy logbook of Elizabethan legal tradition. And as you sit here now, not in church, but beneath your blanket, the same rhythm returns. That soft, repetitive march of obligation, of routines fulfilled, and rules obeyed, not out of fear, but from the strange comfort of predictability. A time when even skipping church had structure. When being scolded by a vicar was just another chapter in the gentle chaos of village life. You smile faintly and imagine yourself there, nodding off mid-sermon again, your chin dipping once, twice, before someone nudges you back to waking life with a whispered Amen. Now, as your mind drifts from the stiff-backed pews and the echo of chapel bells that seem to ring not just in your ears, but in your bones, you shuffle quietly into another, equally odd, but oddly soothing corner of Elizabethan law. The sumptuary laws. Yes, laws about clothing, what colors you were allowed to wear, what fabrics could brush your skin, what kind of fur might grace your collar, and precisely who had the right to sport a feathered cap without accidentally committing a crime of fashion. You might think of getting dressed in the morning as a mundane personal choice. But in the Elizabethan world, your outfit was a legal declaration, a stitched manifesto of your social class, income bracket, and occasionally, your ambition to rise above your station in a rather daring shade of violet. The law books of the day didn't just outline major crimes like theft or treason. They contained meticulous rules about velvet, taffeta, embroidery, and perhaps most scandalously, silk stockings. These weren't mere suggestions. They were codified expectations of decorum, hierarchy, and the divine order, stitched together with thread and reinforced by threat of fine or worse. If you were a mere yeoman and dared to wear silk, you might as well announce to the entire town square that you were secretly trying to marry into the gentry or, heaven forbid, pretending to be a cousin of the Earl of Nowhere. You, of course, born to a modest family with mud on your boots and cabbage in your stew, weren't supposed to wear crimson. Crimson was reserved for the nobles, for those with large manners and larger egos, and possibly for people who owned more than one spoon. If you even thought about wearing a doublet with gold lace, you'd better have at least a knighted uncle or a very convincing forged genealogy tucked up your sleeve. And yet there was something reassuring in all this. You knew where you stood, quite literally, based on the color of your breeches. Browns and grays were your go-to palette, the tones of humility, hard work, and hay dust. You might envy the occasional merchant who flouted the rules with an imported Turkish vest or a scandalously bright sash from Antwerp. But deep down, you appreciated the certainty of it all. A world where outer wear matched inner rank, where you could walk down the muddy street and know, by glance alone, whether the person approaching you was a baronet or just a very fancy liar. Of course, the enforcers of these fashion laws weren't always the most subtle. Town constables occasionally roamed market days, peering suspiciously at cloaks and declaring a piece of trim excessively foreign. Tailors were interrogated for selling French buttons to unqualified customers. And the greatest scandal of 1584, A butcher's wife was caught wearing imported damask and claiming she had found it at the bottom of a barrel of salt fish, which sparked not only a fine, but a month of whispered speculation during Sunday services. Interestingly, some of the laws weren't about status at all, but morality. You were expected to dress modestly, not just in cut, but in intention. No exposed ankles unless you were literally crossing a stream. No excessively pointed shoes unless you had a papal dispensation. Okay, that one might be exaggerated. But genuinely, your clothing was considered part of your moral compass. Too flashy and you were a sinner. Too plain and people assumed you were trying to appear holier than thou. It was a delicate balancing act of dressing like you didn't care what people thought, while deeply caring what people thought. The truly strange thing is how comfort rarely entered into it. Wool in summer, multiple petticoats in spring, and hats so large they could block the sun and still pinch your temples like a crab's claw. But again, none of this was meant to help you feel good. It was meant to make you look appropriate. If you passed out from heat stroke in a triple-layered bodice, at least you did so while legally clothed. Now you might be wondering, did anyone actually get punished? Oh yes, fines were levied, public apologies were issued. And in one memorably tedious case, a minor gentleman was sentenced to a week of church sitting. Yes, sitting. Until he repented for wearing slashed sleeves without noble sanction. Slashed sleeves! All because he wanted to show a little decorative linen underneath. The horror. But of course, the Queen herself was the ultimate trendsetter and enforcer. Elizabethan, who adored pearls, powdered faces, and gowns with enough embroidery to choke a hedgehog, had a vested interest, pun intended, in maintaining the visual order. Her own wardrobe was a political statement, an assertion of dominance, wealth, and careful curation. You, watching her parade past in a festival procession, would have felt the full force of the message. I am your monarch, and I own more lace than your entire parish combined. And so, in your modest jerkin, patched but respectable, you made peace with your place in the fabric of society. Quite literally. You brushed off the occasional insult from a passing dandy, you grumbled about rising ribbon prices, and you nodded sagely when others complained about new money showing off. Because even then, even in a world without influencers or Instagram, there was always someone wearing the wrong thing for the wrong reasons, and always someone else to comment on it. So tonight, as your blanket nestles around you, like the woolen shawl of some long-forgotten village matron, you remember that being dressed just right once required a legal checklist. That comfort came second to compliance. That your cuffs were political and your cloak was an affidavit of your station. And somehow, knowing that everything, even your shoes, was governed by rules you didn't have to make, feels oddly restful. By now, you've gotten used to the quiet rhythms of Elizabethan legality, the sort of laws that didn't so much thunder down from the royal court as whisper from dusty parchment in town archives, rules that rustled like the hems of woolen skirts and echoed like distant church bells on a misty morning. And as you settled deeper into your bedding, into the softness of cotton far too scandalously cozy for the 16th century, we find ourselves walking, slowly, as always, into another curiously comforting law. One that may seem strange at first glance, but promises a sleepy sort of logic once you surrender to its world. The requirement that every parish maintains stocks, pillories, and whipping posts. Yes, oddly enough, there was comfort in knowing exactly where the punishment would happen. These weren't dramatic scenes of torture or drawn-out executions, but instead standardized props in the theater of public order, as predictable as the sermon before supper. The law required every English parish to own and maintain such devices. Not because mayhem was rampant, but because order, above all else, had to be visible. You see, in a world where you couldn't rely on newspapers or social media posts reminding you not to steal your neighbor's cheese, the mere presence of the stocks told you all you needed to know. Here, decorum matters. Here, behavior is watched. And here, if you misbehave, we have a bench for that. And you, of course, don't steal cheese. Not anymore. The funny thing is that most of these punishment tools weren't used as often as you'd think. Stocks sat vacant most weeks, a kind of sleepy threat, almost like a warning from your grandmother's expression rather than her actual words. When someone was locked in place, usually for petty theft, public drunkenness, or failing to attend church regularly, the town would gather not to jeer, but more to note. It was more of a civic event than a spectacle. Children might frown at the offender. Old women would murmur something about virtue. And a baker would probably give the poor soul a leftover crust. In fact, one of the quirkier side effects of this law was the curious pride each village took in maintaining their punishment furniture. Some towns had well-carved, almost lovingly varnished stocks. Others had slightly tilted whipping posts that leaned like elderly churchwardens who'd had a bit too much cider. And in the coastal village of Brancaster, it was rumored the pillory was kept in the same shed as the May Day costumes, causing more than one unfortunate overlap of festivity and discipline. It wasn't all bad. Sometimes, being locked up for a few hours gave you a chance to nap. But these laws weren't just about shaming. They were about reminding. In a place where crime was often born from poverty or desperation, the goal wasn't to ruin you. It was to restore the fabric of the community, to thread you back into the weave, albeit a bit rumpled. After all, you still had to see your neighbors the next morning at the market. You still had to borrow eggs. You still had to sing beside them during psalms. And so the law, as sleepy as it seemed, tried to keep everything balanced. It reminded you not to take more than your share, not to throw turnips at passing clergy, not to insult the parish constable's horse, which had a limp and took offense easily. It whispered, through oak and iron, that this was a place where rules mattered, but where punishment could be mild, gentle, even, so long as you stayed within the narrow, comforting lanes of accepted behavior. Now you're probably wondering, were there rebels? Of course there were. Someone always thinks they're above the rules. A cobbler who refused to remove his hat in church. A widow who sold her pies on the Sabbath. A traveling fiddler who played scandalous tunes about ladies with lace gloves. They came, they strayed, and they stood, usually quite still, for an hour or two under the eyes of sheepish townsfolk. And afterward, they were almost always invited to supper by someone who felt bad. Because here's the thing. These laws weren't brutal. They were familiar. A kind of routine discipline that worked more like a bedtime story than a thunderbolt. You knew the rhythm. Misstep, public correction, quiet return. It was a social yawn more than a roar, and somehow that made the world feel smaller and kinder. And let's not forget the local boys who took it as a sport to repaint the stocks in gaudy colors. Or the vicar who once accidentally locked himself in while showing a visiting bishop how the hinges worked. For all the seriousness, there was always room for absurdity. Always a way for life to leak in around the edges of the law and wrap everything in a cozy wool shawl of mutual understanding. So tonight, as your limbs go heavy and your breath slows, imagine a crooked village square, cobblestones warmed by the sun, the wooden stocks resting quietly under the linden tree. Not in use, just present, just waiting, like the ticking of a reliable clock. You don't feel fear. You feel structure, predictability. Even in discipline, there is something soft about knowing what will happen, when it will happen, and that it will eventually pass. Sleep now, friend. You followed the rules. By now, your breathing has probably slowed, matching the rhythm of the Elizabethan world, where even laws seem to tiptoe politely through the corridors of everyday life, never quite shouting, only gently nudging you back into place with the soft rustle of parchment and the weight of expectation that was more societal than judicial. And as you curl just a little deeper into your blanket, cheek resting warm against a pillow that placidly never smelled of mutton tallow or unwashed wool, we slide into another oddly soothing law. One that regulated not your hands or your voice or even your feet, but the very cloth that wrapped your body. Yes, tonight's comforting decree is the sumptuary law. Now, at first blush, a law about what you're allowed to wear might sound more irksome than relaxing. After all, who wants a rule book for sleeves? But in Elizabethan England, such regulations weren't so much tyrannical as they were reassuringly detailed. You weren't being squashed. You were being sorted, categorized, folded neatly into your place like a linen shirt pressed into a cedar chest. You see, the sumptuary laws decreed, down to the thread count and embroidery pattern, what every person of every rank was allowed to wear. You, of course, are not nobility. Not yet. You were born, let's say, the child of a moderately respectable baker, one with sturdy calves, flour in his beard, and a mild terror of chimney sweeps. As such, your clothing cannot feature gold thread, silk from Italy, or lace finer than a hedgerow spider's web. You may wear brown wool with perhaps a touch of green, if your aunt was particularly generous at Michaelmas. And here's the funny part. These laws were rarely enforced with any real harshness. It was more like a village game. Everyone knew what was allowed. Everyone could identify status on sight. If someone showed up at Sunday Mass in a velvet doublet stitched with pearls, heads would turn, not with rage, but with murmurs of, well, that's a bold choice for a miller's son. And maybe a snort from the curate, because clothing wasn't just fabric, it was grammar. A wool cloak said, I till the land. A satin sleeve whispered, I drink from goblets. A fur collar practically screamed, my cousin married up. And when everyone obeyed the wardrobe rules, it was like reading a sentence where every word sat just where it belonged. Comforting, predictable, soothing, like watching ducks swim in single file. One of the more obscure lines in the sumptuary laws actually dictated the number of plumes one could wear in a hat. You, being of humble stock, were permitted one. One feather, modest, sensible, decorative, but not boastful. More than that, and you might be summoned by the local reeve for a stern talking to, and perhaps a reminder of your standing, delivered while sipping watery ale in the back room of the Guildhall. Of course, exceptions happened. A prosperous farmer might try to sneak in a brighter dye, a sharper buckle, a velvet patch sewn inside his jacket, where no one could see it but himself. And perhaps, if he bowed too deeply, the curious neighbor behind him at the alehouse. But generally, the law held, not because it was harsh, but because it was deeply woven into the culture, like the very warp and weft of the cloth it regulated. And you? Well, your mother hemmed your tunics carefully. Nothing too long, lest someone mistake you for a tutor. No decorative slashing on the sleeves. That was reserved for gentlemen. Just enough embroidery at the collar to show she loved you, but not enough to rouse suspicion. She knew the rules, after all. Everyone did. There's something peaceful about that, isn't there? A world where what you wore was known, expected, even legally defined. No agonizing over outfits, no wondering if you should wear the crimson or the indigo, because you were only allowed russet. And russet was fine. Russet was warm. Russet said, "I'm not trying too hard, but I am clean." It was the fabric equivalent of a polite nod on a cold morning. And the tailors, oh, they loved the sumptuary laws. It gave them structure, boundaries, a sort of textile logic puzzle. You need to look impressive, but you're only allowed this many buttons and no more than 3 pleats. It was like knitting within a sonnet. Restriction breeds creativity, they'd say, as they cleverly layered wool and linen in legal combinations that flattered your posture while preserving your soul from civic punishment. It also made the world feel more legible. You could tell a knight from a clerk, a merchant from a mayor, just by the way his coat fastened or the hue of his stockings. And no one expected you to be more than you were. In fact, pretending to be higher ranked was not just a legal misstep. It was considered tacky, an emotional equivalent of wearing a crown to a bake sale. People would feel embarrassed for you. So when you dressed each morning, still half asleep, your fingers fumbling with laces in the dim light of a dawn that smelled faintly of damp straw and yesterday's broth, you weren't making a statement. You were fitting into a social lullaby. No guesswork, no anxiety. Just the reliable comfort of knowing your place, your color, your fabric, your trim, and the best part, you could always spot a visitor. Some foreign merchant from Antwerp, swishing in silks far too bright, completely oblivious to the gentle gasps of the locals. You'd give them a once-over, raise one eyebrow, just like your uncle taught you, and then go back to nibbling your cheese crust because, really, some people just didn't understand the joy of a properly drab sleeve. Now, as your limbs settle further into stillness and your breathing dips just slightly deeper, let yourself be dressed, gently, tenderly, in a perfectly legal outfit of soft wool and sensible leather, stitched by loving hands under candlelight, approved by the crown, and accepted by the village. There is peace in rules, there is comfort in conformity, and there is something quietly glorious in a world where your cuffs say, "I'm exactly who I'm supposed to be." Sleep tight, little rule follower. You look perfect. The day begins, just as it always does, in Elizabethan England, with the distant toll of a church bell echoing across damp fields and narrow lanes, summoning not only the faithful, but also the bakers, brewers, and fishwives, who all rely, in some way, on the rhythm of rules to give the day shape and, perhaps more importantly, an odd sense of comfort, like the ticking of a very dusty clock. No one ever dares wind, but everyone trusts anyway. You stretch, still bundled in a woolen blanket that smells faintly of elderflower and fireplace soot, and open your eyes to the familiar patterns of ceiling beams and thatch shadows, grateful in your half-sleeping state that today is not one of the days when you must worry about being accused of unlawful loaf production. Because yes, there were, in fact, laws about bread. More specifically, there were laws about the size, weight, and composition of your loaf, and in case you thought you could simply wander into the marketplace and pick out a sweet bun sprinkled with too much honey, know this: Elizabethan regulations had opinions about such things. You, dear listener, live in a time when the assize of bread still casts its long, yeasty shadow across the land. The rule, first baked into existence long before Elizabeth ever held a scepter, ensured that bakers adhered strictly to price controls and weight measures, lest the common folk be swindled with airy loaves, puffed up on deceit. You are, of course, not a baker. You were never very good with yeast. But your neighbor, Thomas the Elder, so-called because his son, Thomas the slightly less elder, works as a pig counter for the sheriff, is a baker. And you know from shared fence-line conversations that he takes these regulations very seriously. Each morning, he weighs his dough with a stone scale and a reverence usually reserved for communion. He whispers to the loaves, presses them with precisely the same pressure, and uses flour that he insists comes from a mill blessed by 3 generations of benign accidents, whatever that means. And he must, because the penalty for light bread is no laughing matter. Historically, those found guilty of baking loaves too small or too expensive could be punished by being publicly pilloried with their underweight bread hung around their necks. A shameful necklace of culinary fraud that could draw jeers, soft vegetables, or worse, mild poetry from nearby schoolchildren. Elizabethan society, for all its gloriously embroidered order, had a deeply sarcastic streak. But the oddest part, and perhaps the most comforting in its oddness, is that many bakers, especially those who feared the shame of a short loaf, created what was known as the vantage loaf, or inbred insurance. That's right. For every dozen loaves a baker sold, they'd throw in a 13th for free, just to stay safely over the legal weight limit. This extra loaf wasn't a gift, so much as a preemptive apology, a quiet hedge against miscalculation, and thus the humble origin of what we now know as the baker's dozen. Of course, as you chew through your own breakfast, a chunk of rye, perhaps, or a barely sweetened bun left from market day, you think about how reliable the world is, when bread is measured not only by hunger, but by law. You don't need to guess how much food you're getting. You don't need to worry that your sixpence will vanish into a puff of flour and empty crust. The government has thought of that. Queen Elizabeth herself, though more often preoccupied with war, wigs, and whether her portrait looked appropriately regal, nonetheless oversaw a system in which your loaf was legally obligated to be filling. And if that's not oddly reassuring, what is? Even more curious is the fact that enforcement of these rules wasn't limited to big cities. In sleepy hamlets with names like Lower Hogsditch or Thistle on the Moor, local officials known as alconers or breadweighers were appointed to go from stall to stall, nibbling, sniffing, and lifting each baker's work with solemn ceremony. You imagine, just for a moment, being one of these inspectors, strolling through the village in a robe that smells like beer and soap, carefully lifting loaves like they're babies, nodding gravely when one feels properly dense, scowling slightly when another seems suspiciously floaty. The community would gather round, of course, pretending to shop for apples or listening for the fishmonger's bell, but really watching you, the arbiter of crumb and crust, deciding whether the day's bread passed the invisible line between acceptable and unacceptable chewiness. And in this world, where even the air smells faintly of barley and clay, where your morning hinges not on existential dread, but on whether the oat loaf will pass muster, you feel something like peace. You know your role. You know what is expected. And should you ever decide to dabble in baking, you already know what to avoid. Short wait, stale crusts, or, heaven forbid, raisins without royal approval. But for now, you simply finish your breakfast, wipe your hands on a woolen napkin that's been used for 3 generations, and smile faintly as Thomas the Elder calls out a greeting through the hedge. He's had a good morning. His loaves passed inspection. His honor remains intact. And yours? Well, your only duty is to feel full, to feel warm, and to rest easy in the knowledge that someone, somewhere, has already measured your bread with care. The sun has now climbed high enough to illuminate the tops of the timber-framed houses in your small Elizabethan village, casting sharp little shadows beneath every lintel and wooden beam. And as you shuffle out of your dwelling, arms bundled in your rough woolen sleeves, you hear the familiar clatter of hooves on the cobbled road, the rattle of a distant cart, and the creak of the alehouse sign swaying in the wind. It's market day, or at least the slightly soggy version of it that occurs when the church calendar has deemed it a lawful day of trade. And you find yourself comforted by the reliable rhythm of regulated chaos. Unregulated it must be, because this is Elizabethan England, and here, even what time you're allowed to shop is a matter of legislative oversight. You don't just wander into the square and hawk your carrots whenever you fancy. No, your produce is permitted only when and where ordained by local charters and enforced by guilds and reeves, and on particularly fussy occasions, wandering magistrates with very shiny boots. You make your way past the row of turnip sellers and women balancing baskets on their hips, and you glance toward the old cloth merchant who always sets up near the well. His bolts of wool are protected not just by canvas awnings, but by the full weight of the Elizabethan Statute of Apparel, which declares who may wear what, and, more importantly, who may not, because in this peculiar pocket of time, even clothing is ruled by law. And you are, in your own modest way, part of a society where your outfit is not just fashion, it's legislation. The law in question, passed in multiple waves and updated with every monarch's mood swing, is a dizzying document that attempts, with varying degrees of success, to organize the entire population into visual categories. Simply put, if you're a nobleman, wear velvet. If you're a tradesman, avoid satin. If you're a servant, keep your sleeves modest, your buttons sparse. And heaven help you if you appear in public wearing a hat with more than one feather. Unless, of course, it's a holiday and the feathers have been inspected. Now, you're not trying to break any rules. You've got your thick brown jerkin, your simple hose, and a cap so unremarkable, it's practically invisible. But you have seen old Arthur, who fancies himself a bit of a poet, strutting around in crimson trim on a Sunday, which is highly suspect behavior for a man who once got caught stealing a sack of barley from his own brother. One can only assume he obtained the fabric from his cousin, who lives near Norwich and trades in surplus curtain offcuts. Either way, you don't mention it. The law may frown upon such fashion fraud, but gossip enforcement is a separate matter, and you have no desire to find yourself accused of malicious whispering, which incidentally is also a finable offense. Still, it's oddly soothing, this world of restrictions. You know where you stand, quite literally, in fact. Since certain tradespeople are assigned fixed stalls on market days, and changing spots without authorization might invite a scolding from the town crier, or worse, a handwritten note from the guildmaster's assistant, which everyone agrees is the dullest punishment of all. And just when you think things couldn't get any more regulated, you pass by the barber surgeon's stand, a glorified tent draped with stained muslin and adorned with a spinning pole that you assume was once red and white, but is now faded to the color of diluted jam. You hear him call out to a customer, tooth pulled and beard trimmed, both before the bell, and you can't help but admire how even health services operate on a tight legal leash. Because yes, there are laws here too. Barber surgeons are forbidden from performing certain medical procedures without the approval of the College of Physicians, unless it's an emergency involving pustules, in which case, oddly enough, they may proceed without paperwork, but only if supervised by a midwife or a cleric. Of course, none of this is written on the wooden board outside his tent. Instead, he's painted a cheerful message. Teeth, lice, and warts removed by noon. Now that's marketing. You pause a moment longer, if only to enjoy the strange comfort of knowing that, should your molars ever betray you, the state has outlined very clearly who may yank them and under what conditions. In this world, where even tooth extraction is bureaucratically blessed, how could you not feel safe? But perhaps the coziest law of all is one you overhear mentioned as you pass a group of children tossing pebbles near a puddle, the beadle's rule of duck-keeping. You chuckle softly, because it's true. There is such a law, or at least there was, somewhere between 1578 and 1584, when the town of Stamford received a complaint from a widow who claimed that her neighbor's ducks were unseasonably conversational. The town responded with a brief but extremely specific ordinance, limiting the number of ducks per household to 4, unless said household was also in possession of a pond of not less than 5 feet in diameter, in which case 2 additional ducks were permitted, but only during months containing the letter R. This, of course, makes no sense whatsoever, but that's Elizabethan law for you. A strange blend of logic, superstition, and a sincere desire to stop neighbors from yelling at each other about poultry. You can't help but feel it, this oddly soft blanket of governance that wraps around your life. You may not have indoor plumbing or reliable medicine or socks without holes, but you do have rules for bread, buttons, and ducks. You have statutes written in ink made from soot and vinegar, proclaimed by men with hats so wide they require separate doorways. You have a world so thoroughly regulated that it has become safe, predictable, warm even. And as you stroll back to your home with a little cloth sack of barley sugar and a bit of salted fish wrapped in waxed parchment, you breathe in the scent of regulation itself, a mix of damp wool, lavender, and candle soot. You open your creaky door, hang your cap on the hook beside the window, and exhale, knowing full well that no one, not even Arthur with his illegal velvet trims, can take that from you. The light in your modest room dims gradually as the clouds roll in from the north, softening the edges of your wooden table and throwing the patchy rushes on the floor into a kind of warm shadow that feels more like a worn blanket than a proper covering. And you sit for a while, resting your sore legs from the slow circuit of the market, letting the faint smell of beeswax and dried rosemary waft in from the hearth, where your mother, still humming the same tune she hums every afternoon, is drying bundles of herbs for the apothecary in the next street, who insists on paying her in salt, which is inconvenient but technically legal under the small trade exemptions clause for barter of perishable goods, as long as it does not exceed the value of a halfpenny loaf. You lean your head back and close your eyes, the murmurs of the outside world reduced to the clatter of hooves, a distant church bell, and the rhythmic thud of your neighbor hammering something, probably the same stool he's been repairing since Lent. It is in this quiet that you remember one of the most peculiar comforts of your time, one so commonplace that you rarely stop to think of it as strange. Yet strange it most certainly is. And that is the Elizabethan fondness for laws that regulate sound. Not noise in the modern sense, mind you. No, this is not about traffic or barking dogs. It's about song, because in the late 16th century, even what came out of your mouth, melodically speaking, could be judged, encouraged, forbidden, or taxed. You hum a little tune yourself now, not quite in key, but neither was anyone else, really, because musical training was limited to those who could afford it. And the rest of you got by with what you heard in taverns, in churches, or on the occasional feast day, when a traveling player might sing a tale of dragons, lost sons, or slightly exaggerated fishing expeditions. Yet Elizabethan England had laws about songs, specific songs. If you sang anything that could be construed as seditious, rude about the Queen, or involving bawdy metaphors about turnips, you could be fined, or, more commonly, placed in the stocks for an hour or two so the community could throw turnips at you in real time. Historians still argue whether a popular ballad known as The Cobbler's Complaint was banned because it implied that shoe leather was less corrupt than Parliament, or simply because the tune was considered too catchy. And while official proclamations varied from county to county, the general rule was this: you may sing, but only if what you sing is in the Queen's favour, not offensive to the church, and performed at a reasonable volume before sunset. Public singing after dark? Not unless you're a licensed caroller or mourning at a wake. Unlicensed harmony was, apparently, a slippery slope. This extended even to things like lullabies, where it was strongly advised that mothers avoid ancient folk melodies from the countryside, especially the ones containing references to witches, talking cows, or men who vanish into trees, even though those were the songs babies liked best. Instead, preferred lullabies were modeled on church hymns, slower, holier, and quite frankly, less catchy. You remember being sung to once during a fever when you were little, a vague memory of damp cloth on your forehead and your grandmother's raspy voice whispering a tune about a boat made of bread that sails to sugar islands. Most likely banned by now, although who really checks on grandmothers? What's even more charming, or baffling depending on your perspective, is that street musicians, those noble pipers, fiddlers, and players of that strange flat drum no one really likes, were required to apply for seasonal licenses from the city officials. This meant that every spring, a long line of aspiring troubadours would line up near the Guildhall, instruments in hand, waiting for a clerk to stamp their names in a register, which permitted them to perform on Thursdays and never near the fishmonger's stall, unless invited. You've seen the parchment once? The license page for the district's summer performers? It listed names like Tom Halftooth, Marjorie of the Cart, and your personal favourite, Alan who only plays during eclipses. These licenses were both protective and restrictive. They allowed musicians to avoid arrest, but also bound them to a series of conditions, such as refraining from playing during sermons, funerals, and particularly tense sessions of the local court. Still, this strange balance between silence and song created a world where sound was not just background noise, but something watched, measured, and cherished. You find this soothing in its own way. The idea that a law once told someone when it was acceptable to hum. And yet not all sound was musical. There were also rules for town criers, those vocal megaphones of civic life, whose shouts broke the morning with proclamations about corn prices, lost dogs, or announcements of upcoming hangings. Tastefully phrased, of course. Each crier had a bell, and regulations stated how many times it should be rung, depending on the importance of the news. Once for weather, twice for church announcements, and 3 times for anything involving pigs. You remember the old crier with the missing tooth, the way he'd shout, 3 barrels of cider, missing from Mistress Elham's barn, reward, none. And then give his bell an extra ring, just for flair. Technically, he wasn't allowed to editorialize, but who would stop him? He had a louder voice than the constable, And so, your world sounds different depending on the day and the laws in force. On Sundays, it's all solemn bells and low mutterings. On market days, it's whistles, shouts, and bartering chants that rise like steam from the crowd. And once a month, there's music. A legal, blessed, state-approved concert of villagers who gather with pipes, spoons, and whatever stringed things they can coax sound from, playing reels and jigs that make even the sternest magistrate tap his foot under the table. You stretch now, arms heavy, eyes low, and let your head tilt to the rhythm of a tune drifting from the neighbor's window. A folk song in C minor, probably not licensed, definitely not sacred, but quietly beautiful. And as you listen, you feel it. Not just the melody, but the safety of knowing that, for all its oddity, your world has carved out even the noise. What is allowed, what is not, and where exactly a person might sit to best hear the next legal song float softly into the dusk. The cobbled stones beneath your feet feel unusually warm for the early hour, still holding on to the final wisps of yesterday's sun. And as you pace slowly along the narrow alley that curves behind the cooper's workshop, careful not to brush your shoulder against the soot-dusted wall, where children regularly chalk crude pictures of sheep and magistrates, you start to think about one of the most peculiar things ever made illegal in your sleepy little corner of Elizabethan England. The wearing of the wrong color. Yes, you live in a world where your choice of fabric hue might earn you a fine, sharp word from the parish constable. Or should you really dare to wear purple while not being the cousin of a duke? A rather public scolding in the stocks, while small children throw dried turnip ends at your shoes. Because as you may recall from the last time your aunt attempted to wear a suspiciously rich shade of blue to church, sumptuary laws weren't just about style or modesty. They were the Crown's way of reminding everyone where they belonged. And where you belonged, of course, was nowhere near velvet. Velvet was dangerous. Velvet whispered of rebellion. Velvet, especially in shades like crimson, plum, or even, gasp, deep forest green, was reserved for people with titles and lands and dinner tables longer than your entire house. You, on the other hand, wore wool. Scratchy, durable, unexciting wool. Preferably brown. Maybe a dull mustard, if your family was feeling extravagant at Michaelmas. But never silk, and certainly never imported taffeta unless you fancied a fine and a sermon. Historians still debate whether these laws were truly about preserving class structure or just a sneaky way to make money off fines. Either way, the legislation was detailed. There were lists, actual parchment scrolls posted outside churches and alehouses that told you precisely what material, color, and number of buttons were allowed for your station. Tailors were even held accountable. If they knowingly stitched a doublet too splendid for the customer's social rank, they could be punished right alongside the wearer. You remember the list posted near the baker's door. Yeomanry may not wear silk hose. Apprentices forbidden from striped garments. No fur of ermine or fox for those below rank of knight. Women of merchant stock may wear lace of bone, not of gold. Bone lace. Imagine. Your neighbor, Edith the chandler's daughter, tried to make her own lace once, boiling fish bones and twisting them with string. The result smelled awful, but did hold together admirably. until a mouse made off with it midwinter. Still, there was something comfortingly rigid about it all. You never had to wonder what to wear. The rules made that decision for you. And, as strange as it sounds, there was a certain social warmth in the uniform drabness. You knew who you were, and who others were, simply by looking at the hem of their cloak. The baker's hem frayed at the heel. The parson's hem was mended in blue thread. The widow's was black and thick, and dragged a little in the mud. Of course, the rules didn't just apply to outerwear. Underclothes were also governed by expectations. Linen, if you could afford it. Hemp, if not. No frills, no embroidery, no imported trim. There was even one instance you recall vividly, where a certain well-to-do merchant's wife dared to commission a chemise with a scalloped collar, stitched with gold thread. When she wore it to a wedding, there was scandal, not because anyone disliked the collar, but because it looked suspiciously like something a gentlewoman might wear, and that simply would not do. The collar had to be burned, publicly, with witnesses and a brief homily about the dangers of ambition. But not all sumptuary rules were enforced so grimly. Some became excuses for pageantry. On May Day, for example, the rules were briefly relaxed in many towns, and anyone could wear garlands, sashes of dyed cloth, or even painted wooden jewelry. For that one day, you could be whoever you wanted. A knight, a lady, a flower fairy with bells on your sleeves, and no one would stop you. You looked forward to May Day more than your birthday. You once wore a tunic dyed with beetroot, tied at the waist, with a cord stolen from the laundry line. You felt magnificent. Interestingly, the laws even crept into professions. If you were a butcher, you were supposed to wear a white apron. If you were a scrivener, a black one. Midwives wore blue sashes during births. And lawyers, those clever devils, wore robes so stiff and fur-lined, you sometimes wondered how they sat down at all. There was even a law that prohibited barbers from dressing too richly, lest clients confuse them with physicians who were supposed to look expensive, whether or not they actually knew what they were doing. Now, you might think this obsession with clothing would make people resentful, that they'd rebel or start weaving clandestine cloaks of velvet in their basements. But mostly, they complied. Because the penalties were real, and because, deep down, everyone liked the feeling of belonging. You weren't just wearing wool. You were wearing your place in the world. And that wool came with stories. The sheep who grew it may have lived in the hills near Norwich. The dye may have been mixed with stale ale and elderberries. Your mother probably stitched the hem while humming a psalm and scolding your little brother for chewing on a spoon. By the time you wore it, that garment was as familiar to you as the cobblestones under your feet, or the smell of the neighbor's wet dock. And then, of course, there were the rebels. There are always rebels. A traveling poet once came through your town wearing a cloak the color of a crushed plum. No one knew his name. He recited verses about stars and sea monsters, and when the constable asked about his license, he claimed he was born under a comet and therefore exempt from all earthly laws. He was escorted out before sundown, but you still remember that cloak. It swirled like a shadow, made of ink. That image returns to you now, faint and curling at the edge of your memory, as the daylight outside your little house fades into soft twilight. You sit beside the fire, your woolen sleeves smelling faintly of smoke, and pull your shawl tighter, not because of the cold, but because you like the weight of it, the way it settles around you like a rule you've learned to love. And in this moment, you're entirely at peace. You may not wear silk or velvet or even striped hose, but you have your dignity, your hearth, and your perfectly legal wool tunic dyed with onion skins and hope. And that, in this world of oddly comforting laws, is more than enough. By now your feet are sore from wandering through the winding corridors of Elizabethan law, and your woolen cloak, perfectly drab and legally compliant, flutters just slightly as you settle on the wooden bench outside your neighbor's cottage, the one with the slanted roof and ivy-covered chimney, where cats with questionable ownership come and go like tiny monarchs. And while you've already trudged through laws about clothing, public cleanliness, bread weights, and who may fish where and when, there's still one realm of odd legality that tickles your sleepy curiosity. And that is the curious set of laws meant not to punish or restrain, but to encourage kindness, piety, and surprisingly, often, the mandatory ringing of bells. Yes, you've arrived at the laws of moral instruction and collective ritual, rules so earnestly designed to shape your daily routine that they practically schedule your yawns. Take, for instance, the rule that required you to attend church every Sunday or pay a fine. This may not sound shocking today, but back then, failure to attend wasn't just a matter between you and your vicar. It was a state offense. If your pew was empty too many weeks in a row, not only would your absence be noted with raised brows and sniffed disapproval, but you might find yourself facing a sternly worded visit from the church warden, a man with suspiciously polished boots, and a fondness for reminding others of the Queen's divine authority. But more than that, these laws governed sounds, schedules, and small daily kindnesses. Every parish bell tower had to ring out, not just for services, but at prescribed times throughout the day. Curfew bells, work bells, market bells, and sometimes bells rung simply to signal that, yes, this part of England was still here. Thank you very much. You learn to mark your day by these tones. Wake with the work bell. Break your fast at the mid-morning peal. Start heading home when the evening bell hums low. It was as though the government had installed a kindly old uncle in every steeple, chiming reminders not to forget your bread, your prayers, or your manners. And manners, of course, were subtly legislated too. Not directly, but through a web of implied expectations. It was encouraged, for instance, to share surplus harvest with your neighbors during lean winters. There wasn't always a written law for this, but let's just say that not doing so would make you the subject of whispered laments during church potluck and possibly exclude you from the next pig roast. And there were actual rules about hospitality. If you were an innkeeper, for example, you were required to house travelers and not overcharge for ale. There were official ale testers who would measure the strength of your brew and the depth of your tankards. One such tester in your town carried a special stick marked with honest measurements. If your mug fell short, you'd be fined and shamed. The pub down the lane was famously short by 2 fingers, which is why it's now nicknamed the Miser's Mug. Another rule that's always stuck with you is the one about apprentices and their nightly candle. Every evening, young apprentices were expected to put out their candles at a certain hour to prevent fire and mischief. This too was enforced. A neighbor down your lane once got fined for letting her apprentice stitch lace past curfew. The boy was only 11, and the lace was for his sister's wedding. But rules were rules. Lace is lovely, sure, but no excuse for sleepy stitching after dark. Historians still argue whether these gentle enforcement laws were effective governance or simply quaint theatre, symbolic structures that mostly functioned through peer pressure. After all, how often were the church bells actually rung on time? How many tankards were really tested? And did anyone truly know if you skipped evening prayers or whispered a naughty rhyme instead? But the laws remained, printed in thick Gothic script and pinned to notice boards across the realm, like bedtime instructions issued by a very stern but secretly caring nanny. Now, not every law was so gentle. There were rules against swearing, against gambling on holy days, and curiously, against idle standing in certain public places. This one you always found amusing. Apparently, just loitering by the bridge too long could earn you a scolding and a shove. It wasn't about crime. It was about energy, the Protestant work ethic, the idea that people should be doing something useful at all times, even if that something was just moving your cart full of turnips along at a more determined pace. You remember being caught once, as a boy, sitting on the edge of the well with your friend Elias, tossing pebbles into the water and pretending they were sailors. The constable, round-bellied and pink in the nose, told you that while he admired your imagination, he'd prefer to see it channeled into sweeping the alley. So you swept, slowly, with frequent stops for storytelling. But you did sweep. And then there were the laws about public announcements. Certain declarations, births, deaths, found pigs, had to be shouted by the town crier, a man with a brass bell, a love of velvet breeches, and a tendency to elongate vowels dramatically. Oh yes, he'd call, even when everyone in the square already knew that Mistress Whittaker's goat had been discovered sleeping in the vicar's laundry again. Still, it was comforting, regular, predictable. The voice of legal order bellowed in rhyme and repeated at dusk. What strikes you now as you sit quietly with your thoughts, the last light of the sun fading behind the treetops and the fire inside crackling in a pot of bean stew, is how many of these odd old laws were less about punishment than pattern. They gave shape to the day, to the year, to your role in the world. You knew when to rise, when to pray, when to close your shutters. You knew how much ale was too much, how long your sleeves could be, whether your lace was lacy enough. The very rhythm of life was backed by law, yes, but a law often softened by communal understanding and decades of sleepy repetition. And now, with the embers glowing and your breath just beginning to slow, you realize that these odd little mandates, however unnecessary they might seem to a modern eye, once made the world feel safe, structured, and cozy. A world where people were fined for wearing too much lace, but never forgot to ring a bell for supper. By now, your feet barely whisper against the well-worn path leading back to your cottage. Your thoughts sluggish, your shoulders gently weighted with the dust of the day. And somewhere in the distance, though you no longer need the bell to tell you, you can almost hear the faint echo of that evening chime that once reminded every soul in your sleepy village to close their shutters, pull the curtains, and prepare their minds for rest. For in this final stretch of Elizabethan oddity, we arrive at the laws that governed not the great affairs of state or the lofty concerns of nobility, but the delightfully mundane business of death, burials, and the proper treatment of one's bones. Yes, you've stumbled upon the quiet regulations that insisted, politely but firmly, on how your body was to be handled once you ceased your noble labor of living. In Elizabethan England, you didn't simply perish and disappear. No, there were rules to follow, and rules to be followed about the rules. And if you failed to adhere to them properly, your poor soul might be fined, or worse. Your burial might be deemed improper, which in those days felt about as scandalous as hosting a dinner party and forgetting the spoons. One such law, passed in 1666 but enforced for decades like a lingering curfew, required that all bodies be buried in wool. Pure English wool, not linen, not silk, and certainly not imported cloth. This had nothing to do with warmth in the grave, of course, and everything to do with the sagging wool industry. In an attempt to boost demand, Parliament decided the dead ought to contribute, quite literally, by becoming wool-wrapped advertisements for patriotic economics. So when you passed, your family had to sign an affidavit that you were, indeed, interred in an all-wool shroud. If they lied, they could be fined, and your final nap would be marred by the shame of flannel fraud. Historians still argue whether people complied out of genuine loyalty to English sheep, or merely folded under the pressure of nosy neighbors peeking into coffins. Either way, the burial in wool became a sleepy fixture of rural life, a legal detail woven into the fabric of grief and ceremony. You remember hearing your great-aunt muttering once, "He was a kind man, generous and good, but oh, the scratch of that wool. It never suited his skin." And thus, even in death, the law itched. But there were more subtle dictates about death, too. Funerals had to occur during daylight, not because it made them more solemn, but because it made them more visible. Mourning attire was expected, but not too flashy. Black was preferred, and though velvet might impress the mourners, it also might raise eyebrows if worn by a carpenter's widow. There was an unspoken expectation to grieve decently, without excessive display, which of course varied depending on your social standing and the mood of your local vicar. Even graveyards weren't exempt from regulation. Laws governed their boundaries, how close bodies could lie, and even when and how bones could be moved if space ran short. In some parishes, bones of the long dead were quietly relocated to charnel houses, stacked reverently, skull to femur, a gentle reminder that space was limited and eternity, while poetic was best managed with efficiency. And you, yes, you, probably strolled past such bone stacks without ever thinking twice, admiring the moss or chasing a beetle, unaware that Your ancestors were neatly organized behind that stone wall. One particularly odd law from the era required that certain bell-ringing rituals accompany deaths, not just funeral tolls, but warning bells that signaled contagion. During plague years, if someone perished from suspicious causes, their death had to be publicly announced, not with a whisper, but with a clang, a sound that carried across rooftops and lanes like a metal bird of ill omen. You were taught, as a child, to freeze when the plague bell rang, to press your handkerchief to your face, and count your steps backward toward home. You didn't always understand why, but the law did. And that was enough. And yet, amid all this regulation, there was something oddly comforting in the predictability of it all. You knew what to wear. You knew what to say. You knew that when you died, someone would dress you in wool, ring the appropriate bell, and carry you down the trodden path, lined with yew trees, where the ground had already been consecrated, and the earth was just dry enough to accept you with grace. You wouldn't vanish. You'd be processed. And then, as if the laws sensed that all this order might leave the soul feeling a bit too squared off, there were also rituals of joyful regulation, feast days, wake customs, and licensed mourning songs. Yes, even songs had guidelines. In certain parishes, the singing of dirges was not only allowed, but gently encouraged, provided they contained no profanity, no improvised lyrics, and certainly no fiddles. One local tale told of a grieving widow who dared to accompany her wailing with a hurdy-gurdy, only to have the constable arrive halfway through the lament with a firm frown and an even firmer citation. Now, as your mind drifts across the grassy fields of old England, and the sun tucks itself behind the thatched rooftops, you feel the great yawn of history stretching over your body like a woolen blanket, itchy but familiar, heavy but reassuring. The laws may have been peculiar, some downright bizarre, and a few amusingly unnecessary, but they carried with them the sleepy cadence of routine, the slow and predictable rhythm that let you know that even in confusion, someone, somewhere, had tried to write it all down, to regulate the chaos, to assign a bell, a fee, a fabric, or a fine to the oddness of being alive. So you close your eyes, swaddled in wool, safe in the knowledge that in Elizabethan England, even death had paperwork, and even your final breath came with instructions, dry, precise, and oddly comforting.